Hello. Welcome, welcome. Hello, everybody. My name is Rochelle Esterhazy, and I'm going to chair this wonderful joint keynote today. Welcome, everyone. Before I'm going to start introducing our wonderful speakers, I have actually a very important question to all of you who have been to the social event yesterday. One of our coordinators has lost a very important bag. It's the conference bag, and it had very important documents in it. So if anyone picked up another bag yesterday and you find something in there that doesn't belong to you, please come to us. That's probably the bag we're looking for. So, thank you. All right, so I'm very pleased to introduce to you our two wonderful colleagues, Naomi Winston and Crina Damsa. And I have a little introduction for both of them. Naomi Winston is professor of educational psychology and the director of the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey in the UK. She's a cognitive psychologist specializing in the processing and implementation of feedback, educational transitions, and educational identities. Naomi has led several research projects funded, amongst others, by the Higher Education Academy, the Medical Research Council, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, and the Society for Research into Higher Education. She currently also co-leads the early emerging field group on the black box of feedback, capturing cognitive, affective, and behavioral indicators of feedback effectiveness, together with Anastasia from yesterday. Naomi is also a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a national teaching fellow in the UK. Karina Damsha is an associate professor at the Department of Education and currently also Vice Dean of Innovation and Digitalization at the Faculty of Educational Science at the University of Oslo in Norway. She's an associate editor of the journal Frontline Learning Research, that is an early journal, and the Journal of the Learning Sciences. She also served as a member of the Early Executive Committee and as a SIG coordinator for many years. Karina is PI of several projects funded by the Research Council of Norway on collaborative problem solving and multimodal learning analytics, as well as interdisciplinary learning and teaching in higher education and schools. She also leads the Early Center of Excellence in Research on digital tracing and analysis of collaborative learning. Well, dear Naomi and Karina, thank you for being here and taking on the challenge of having a joint keynote. We're very much looking forward to the talk. The floor is yours.
I'll just do a sound check. Everyone can hear me? Hello, very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for allowing us to contribute to advancing the academic conversation, which we hope to initiate between our two SIGs. I will start our presentation, but before doing so, I would like to ask, what do you know what this is? Anyone? Ellie? What about this? Maybe this helps.
Oh, yes, it's a bee hotel.
In?
Is it in Oslo?
It's in Oslo. So what you see on the map, it's actually a bee highway map in the United Kingdom. And what you see on the other side, it's a bee pollinator station in Oslo, in Norway. Bee highways, or bee circuits, in the United Kingdom are intended to be developed, and they will be, if they're developed, about 17,000 kilometers, covering 51,000 square meters. We know why this is being done, and we are thankful to Kathleen to introducing the bee metaphor. We loved it. So, at the risk of being a little unoriginal, we're going to hijack the bee metaphor and continue. Kathleen invited us to be pollinators, like bees are. And what these projects do, the reason why we are showing it, is because they provide infrastructure for the bees to survive and to be to do what they do normally, So they won't survive without infrastructure. They will disappear as a species. And okay, maybe it's a long shot, but we want to provide, we claim it's the same in our case. We can intend to be pollinators, but we need infrastructure. We need help, we need a community, just like the bees, and we need to develop a fundament. We need to learn about how to learn from each other, and we'll need to engage in practice. So what you see here is actually an original station by the inventor of this idea, an Argentinian architect. Here you see workshops where kids learn how to learn about pollination. And here you see actually enacted practice. All right, so already you realize this is going to be a different type of keynote. And we took the liberty to relabel this session into a collaborative space note, as to speak, because we want to make it interactive. So we are the ones who received the task to initiate the discussion, cross-pollination, but we see it as a joint effort to reflect, criticize, analyze, and contribute expertise and ideas into the discussion that already started. So we hope to initiate cross-pollination by taking the departure point in our own research. So moving on to what we want to discuss and what we aim with this, joint keynote should be a collaborative note. We want to acknowledge the complexity of framing learning and feedback processes. I'm a learning researcher, and Naomi researches extensively feedback processes. We will be taking our research as a departure point when we try to engage in the conversation. And we will be highlighting and illustrating conceptual frameworks, methods, topical work in research on learning and feedback, and connecting to educational practice. And not least, the most important part of our contribution today is to initiate a discussion about value of future research synergies, hopefully between the SIGs, if not only between our own research. This is the structure of the talk. We're going to start by framing learning and feedback as notions, as constructs. We will select conceptual approaches and illustrations from our own research, and we will be using these 4 structuring questions to engage with that. And I'm not going to go through the questions now. We're going to take them one by one later on. And we will invite you to engage in discussing value of research synergies and your ideas about it, actually. So we hope you don't feel uncomfortable. We will actually give you some work to do during the session. So let's move on. Before moving on to actually the substantive part of our talk, we want to position ourselves and our research in the field.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. So as Rochelle mentioned, I'm a professor of educational psychology, but I also lead the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey, and also lead a research lab, the Surrey Assessment and Learning Lab. My interests in feedback are varied. As a psychologist, I am fascinated by the way in which feedback information is processed and how that processing influences the implementation of feedback and how it's used within practice. But I also have an interest in the tools that we use, digital tools, symbolic tools that are used within feedback processes, because these really shape what we are and are not able to do, and how those processes then have an impact on learning. And I also have an interest in feedback process and policy. So I'm very interested in the way in which feedback processes are positioned within strategic documentation, and I'll say a little bit about this later on, and the way in which the policy decisions that are made about the way in which feedback processes should operate open up and also shut down opportunities for different approaches to be used in our everyday work with students.
Thank you, Naomi. I will just say a few words about my background. As I said, I'm a learning researcher. My main area of research, and this is in somehow chronological order. I started my PhD work and continue it by looking at collaborative learning in small groups. Continue with student engagement and agency. Nowadays, I am more involved in and interested in technology-enhanced learning and CSCL, which is Computer Supported Collaborative Learning. Rachel mentioned a project which is a co-PI too on collaborative analytics. I've been active in learning design, not only designing as an academic developer, but also researching it, so how teachers design and co-design with students. Lately, I am also developing an agenda on platformization of education, and I'll show an example actually from work done in our group today. And obviously, I'm teaching, I'm an academic developer, and I'm also contributing to innovation projects. And you see two topics hanging here on the side, no, actually here. And those are my, let's say, my hobby topics, but they're very important, which is literacy of minority Roma children in Romania, where I come from, and youth learning about sustainability. So, returning to our questions. What conceptual approaches inform understanding of learning and feedback in higher education research? And I'll refer, obviously, to the learning part. It's a quick go-through. We have a lot of material, so I'll race through this. But it's a question. It can be an open question, but we have the answer to it. It's just that we have a very long list there. I just started it, and it's an endless list. We investigate cognitive processes, behaviors, effects, experiences, social interactions, when we claim we study learning, right? So this raises the question of what learning is, how we examine it. And I'm not going to go into defining learning. We're going to talk about what constitutes learning, perhaps, and all its complex elements. And this is a long-standing discussion, and it goes way back. So I'm not going to go to the history, but there is somehow a conclusion in the field that learning is a process. It constitutes of a process and its outcomes. Yet, we still discuss this and debate it when we set up our research design, whether we are investigating enough of a process or whether we should just focus on the outcomes and so on. In 1995, Hutchins proposed this learning theory model, which claims that learning is distributed. So it's not just a cognitive process, not just the outcomes. It's distributed across the individual. This is his famous model, how pilots learn speed. It's a learning process as well. So it's an individual process, a cognitive process. These pilots have knowledge, but they have to enact it. They have to apply it in the cockpit. If they don't do anything, nothing happens. The learning doesn't happen, the plane doesn't fly. But also, it's dependent on the instruments, how they function, and the knowledge built into those instruments. So learning is also distributed in the concrete context. Yet, this is still a debated issue while posed in 1995. And the field has ever since, it's been decades now, has been advancing. And what I'm posing here is that there are approaches to learning that are very important, and some of us as learning researchers we engage with, take them into account. Others continue on more traditional ways of investigating learning. And our talk today is about trying to understand why we're doing that and how we can actually build on each other's ways of doing research on learning, in my case. So what I'm claiming here, and this is actually in a learning context, in a school in the US, in the Connected Learning Design Project, where kids from disadvantaged contexts, environments, come to learn STEM, mathematics, physics, and so on. And you see this girl here who has a Hispanic background, performing, enacting. She's building an instrument, probably in a physics subject. She is in a group, so she is interacting also, so it means this is a social aspect of the process. She is situated, in this case, in the classroom, but the classroom is kind of a replica of a real, let's say, industrial site or a laboratory and so on. She is supported by the tools, so the tools are part of what she's doing and how she's learning. And if we think of her background, she comes from a background where she has not necessarily learned STEM, possibly from her parents. She had a trajectory, and these are youth clubs where children come to get help to actually develop intellectually. And maybe she also has, there is an affective component there too. So this is a holistic, let's say, ecological perspective to learning. And I'll return to this with some examples. But what I'm trying to say here, and this is not to raise tensions, is to raise awareness that we still have a dividing line between classical and the emergent approaches to learning and activity, and we invite you to actually reflect on that. And I identified, let's say, 2 lines to not become too complex. One is the epistemological versus ontological, and it should not be versus. So the epistemological, it's about learning, understanding knowledge, a concept. If we take the cross-pollination notion, this is about understanding what it means and integrate it in our system of knowledge and concepts, and perhaps the role of the bees in cross-pollination. When it comes to ontological, it's the internalization of the concept relating it to own life world, perhaps to activities we engage in, or using it to initiate action to help pollination, right? So it's about how we learn about the process and what we do with it in our lives, daily lives or intellectual activities. When it comes to positivist and realist, I mean, this is more classic discussion, so I don't need to tell too much about it, but this is relates to how we conceptualize and operationalize, interpret the notion. How do bees learn to cross-pollinate? Do we want to understand that, like to make an analogy with learning? So do we examine how many times the bee travels to pollination site, the types of sites, and the result of pollination, more fruit? Or do we want to understand the quality of the life of that bee in a particular space, time, in the period of her travels, in order to understand how she behaves? Or do we want to understand both? So my point is here, we're hinting at synergies and dialogue. And I think I will give the word to Naomi.
Thank you, Karina. So I will say a brief word about framing feedback, as that has important implications for research, but I will start by saying I do not want to open up discussion about what feedback is or what feedback isn't. I just want to acknowledge complexity, because I think that's really important when we're looking for research synergies. We need to surface and talk about some of these complexities. So we need to think about what feedback even is. Is it a product? Is it a process? Do we even need to separate these things? Those 2 things interact. But it's important when we're looking at research to situate our framing of feedback. Who is involved in feedback? This will naturally lead to decisions about who our research participants are. Is feedback something only provided by teachers, or are students involved in generating their own feedback or feedback for peers? What about the role of non-human actors? So really growing appreciation of the socio-material dimension within feedback research. And it's really important to reflect on these differences in opinion. As a psychologist trained in experimental psychology, I had no grounding in socio-materiality, yet colleagues have taught me so much and made me think so differently about all of the assumptions that I hold about what learning is and what feedback can be. So these questions are so important. What counts as feedback, again, will lead to very important decisions we make in research design. Are we talking about the formal artifacts that constitute feedback information, the written comments on an assessment, the verbal dialogue that might take place between a student and their supervisor? What about what goes on in the classroom? There is a much broader representation of feedback that happens in everyday classroom discourse. Understanding that and how it contributes to learning is complex, but also very important. And student self-evaluation, there's all this work that's going on inside a student's mind when they're engaging with peers and with their own work and with teachers. How is that informing learning? And finally, one that I am particularly interested in at the moment is how do we evidence the effectiveness of feedback? We would argue perhaps that as a field, there's been a dominant focus on self-report measures, in particular, self-report measures of the student satisfaction with feedback, to the extent that in many studies and in many situations such as student evaluation surveys, we assume feedback is effective if students are satisfied and happy with it. That relates in no way to learning. We can look at attainment. We can look at changes in grades from one assessment to another. We can look at what students change in their work. So, for example, in the field of second language learning, that measure of repair rate, what students actually change in subsequent work as a result of feedback, gives us an indication of its effectiveness. But then we come to the really messy, muddy area in terms of changes in things that we can't observe. So changes in motivation, changes in students' approaches to learning, their perceptions of themselves and others. And this is what Anastasia and I are addressing with our emerging field group, this black box of so many complex processes that are likely affected by feedback, but are much more challenging to study. So I now want to move on to present 2 brief examples from my own research program, which start to illustrate some of the different approaches that we can take to feedback research. The first comes very much from a socio-constructivist perspective, understanding the effectiveness of feedback as mediated by students' engagement with that information, the sense-making, the dialogue, how they construct meaning from what is essentially information that they receive. So in 2017, we published a systematic review of the literature on students' engagement with feedback. And one of the things we tried to do within this review was to map the recipients' processes, the key skills and capacities that are needed in order to use feedback effectively. So this was before the boom in research on feedback literacy. We were talking about this in a slightly different way in terms of recipients. And what we did through looking at the literature were uncover 4 key recipients' processes, what we call these skills that are needed, and thinking then about how we can nurture them. So the first is self-appraisal, being able to look critically at oneself. It's very difficult to use feedback effectively if we don't have that capacity. Assessment literacy, knowing what good work looks like, understanding standards and criteria. Again, it's very difficult to use feedback to improve our work if we don't know where we're trying to get to. Goal setting, self-regulation is the third, the capacity to set targets on the basis of feedback and then monitor and adjust our behaviors as we work towards achieving those goals and targets. And finally, engagement and motivation. So there is a really important motivational dimension to putting feedback into practice. It's hard work, and we need to be willing to put in that hard work. So this is an example of very much a big picture research approach, trying to map a literature and trying to draw out some overarching themes. My second example is the opposite. It's zooming in to one of these processes and trying to understand something quite small but in significant detail. So Anna has set this up beautifully because she alluded to this study in her keynote yesterday. When we're thinking about engagement with feedback, it's a very complex concept and we need to start breaking that down. And one of the things that we were interested in as a potential index of students' engagement with feedback is what they remember, what they take away from feedback information. And we were particularly interested in whether there was a difference in memory for evaluative, past-oriented comments that inform students how they have performed on a particular task, versus exactly the same information framed as a directive comment, information that guides them towards future improvement and gives them pointers as to how to go about doing that. And we predicted that memory would be far superior for the directive type of feedback for 2 reasons. One, if you ask students what they want from feedback, they want to know how to improve. And second, and this is where we start to look at cross-pollination. If we look at the broader prospective memory literature, there's lots of evidence that we tend to be much better at remembering information if we think we're going to be using it at some point in the future. And that's exactly what directive feedback is. It's telling us, here's something that you can take and use in the future. So we had students complete a writing task. They came back to the lab a couple of days later to get feedback information, which they believed was personalized. This was an experimental study, so it wasn't, but they believed it was. They read feedback on their writing. We then told them the whole time that they were going to be using this feedback very shortly. They were going to be completing a second writing task. They did a short filler task, did some logic puzzles, and then the really important part of our design happened. We gave them a surprise memory test. We asked them to write down as much as they could remember from the feedback information they'd received just 5 minutes prior. And what we found was surprising for 2 reasons. One, after a 5-minute delay, memory for feedback is really poor. On average, they remembered 3 out of 20 comments after 5 minutes. And this is self-relevant feedback. They believe it's self-relevant, and they believe they're going to be using it again very shortly. But in terms of the evaluative directive difference, we found, Anna referred to yesterday's paradoxical finding. Over many experiments now, we have demonstrated, we've replicated an evaluative recall bias. Memory is so much stronger for that past-oriented information than the future-oriented directive comments, and I'll return to this a little bit later. But what this demonstrates is when we are being informed in our predictions by research from another area of the literature, we have to test those assumptions. We can't assume that those findings from the general prospective memory literature will mean that memory is superior for directive comments. We need to test those assumptions because what applies in one context will not necessarily apply in another. Karina.
Thank you. I'll move on to discuss social cultural perspectives on learning, which I used a lot in my research, in especially qualitative research. And those who are not familiar, I'm not going to lecture on social cultural perspectives. Many of you already use these notions. Learning from this perspective is an interactional process of meaning or sense-making, so creating understanding, constructing understanding. So there is already a link, and sociocultural notions are sort of branched out from social constructivism. Some would say, some would disagree. Situated in a context, it can be of the discipline, social, cultural, or historical. And this means that dialogue of sense-making, when people, learners, come together and discuss, always involves knowledge that belongs to discipline, or a culture, or a particular context. So it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And also, there is an assumption, a premise that this, learning is mediated by tools and objects. We use language. Language is the most important tool, according to Vygotsky. And Vygotsky was mentioned yesterday. I mean, the social-cultural perspective is sort of a conglomerate of ideas, of some older notions and some more contemporary ideas and models. And we're all familiar with the zone of proximal development by Vygotsky that gave us this idea of one learning from a more, or together with a more knowledgeable other through dialogue using language. And this is especially in child psychology. Two activity theory promoted by Iri Engström that looks at the other end of the spectrum, that looks at norms, community, and how dialogue and language and culture helps learning in organizations. So within that range, there are many more notions and much more to think about. But how did I use this in my research and together with some colleagues? We looked at dimensions of interactions, and we identified, and these are results, in fact, we identified an epistemic dimension that's where students in higher education, in this case, talk about knowledge, try to understand concepts. In software engineering, students really try to understand coding notions, and teacher education, they try to understand didactical notions. We realized that we have to obviously look at regulative aspects or procedural, how they organize that discussion and collaboration. Obviously, we have to look at the social relational, how the talk goes, what's actually talk on task, to take a social constructivist notion, and what's actually social talk, and so on. But what's distinctive and what became actually the focus of many studies, of two of which listed here, is this work on shared objects. And the object can be a text, a report students work on. They can be code in order to develop a website, for example. And this is a very important aspect of collaboration because that shared object actually drives the dialogue. So the learning happens, or it's more focused and more convergent around when students in groups talk about it. And here you have an example from computer engineering or software engineering, where you can see that students, besides talking around the table, they use talking about the website they are working on. They are programming using HTML and other programming languages. They're using also all kinds of tools. It's a computer, it's an analog tool there. The girl is showing a drawing, a mock-up, and so on. So dialogue doesn't happen just through language. That's basically the main claim. But what we are interested in, and what we started to reflect on after many studies and analysis, is where do we and how do we recognize learning in the dialogue and in what students do? Is it in the productive interaction? Is it when interaction is productive? When is interaction productive? When they demonstrate they understood a concept? When students demonstrate that by performing an action, by actually implementing it in the code together, so the code progresses? and leads to an output, by having that artifact developed, the website, by delivering to stakeholder demands. These students had actually external stakeholders, and they had to deliver a product. Is that a sign or an indication of learning at some sort of meso level? So these are questions, and I don't have answers, but of course I have reflections on this, and we're happy to discuss this further. But the point to make here is that social cultural notions help assist in understanding discursive dialogue, but they need a different way of, they need to be actually combined with other ways of seeing learning that involve materiality, that involved context, that involved perhaps aspects of time. So I'm coming here to a perspective that is perhaps less used, and I myself, I'm starting to explore, together with Andres, a Ph.D. student who's sitting right there, and together with some other colleagues. And the idea here is we're bringing post-humanist notions into the thinking about learning, which involves thinking of trajectories, thinking of context students come from, thinking of the resources this context provide to students or lack of them. So this is a complex model, but we don't have to go into details. The idea is that we have here the social ecology of a student, and it can be also an intellectual ecology, right? It's the academic context. It's also the professional context. The students in computer engineering are getting a lot of input from the professional community of programmers and learn a lot through that channel. There are hobbies and other knowledge sources online and study peers and so on. But the point is, it's about activities and how they enact those. In addition, there is the environment, the context, and I use mode here just to signal the difference between a material mode, being in the campus, being in the classroom, being able to talk to their peers using different type of tools, or being online. And now we've learned a lot about how it is to be online and what kind of tools we're getting, we have available, and what we're missing in terms of social presence and social interaction. So the idea of an ecological perspective is about how all this comes together and how learning looks like, how a student goes through or experiences as all these elements in their relationship and how that can be generative of learning. So this is more of a reflection. And I'm going to save time, and we're going to move on to a small interactive moment where we actually, based on what we put forward here in terms of results, reflections, questions, ask you to think about your own position in your own research area and what concepts you're using, or conceptualization, conceptual frameworks, and how could other areas of research benefit from your perspectives. So we will give you 5 minutes. And we would invite you to reflect, either alone or preferably with your neighbor. And we did our empirical observation. We know that you're sitting with your peers. So try to think out of the box. And we invite you to put your idea out of the box on Padlet. The link is here and also in the guidebook. So if you go to the session, you can just click on the link and add a statement. It can be a sentence, a phrase. And let's say you have 5 minutes. Really late. Mind you, we'll return to the Padlet at the end of the session, so we'll look at your statements together.
left one or the middle one? The middle one. Okay. One more. Okay, I hate to interrupt the buzz in the room, but I think we will be returning to these ideas later. So park those thoughts, keep hold of them, and we will revisit. So we're now going to move on to the second of our questions to move from conceptual approaches to methods, and a few short illustrations of methods we've used in our own research and some of the ways in which we've borrowed and been guests in other areas and using different methods. So the first method that I will share follows on my research on the evaluative recall bias in feedback. One of the things that we came to first as a question was, is this an attentional effect? Do people remember evaluative feedback better than directive feedback? Because somehow at the point of encoding, they are paying more attention to the evaluative feedback. So we did a very simple replication where we had the same design, but we used eye tracking to test whether there is an attentional explanation for our effect. And we also used a goal-setting manipulation in some of these studies, which I won't talk through. But you can see for yourself when we look here at the mean dwell time per word for evaluative and directive comments, there is no difference. So this was perhaps a very narrow, again, zooming in type of approach, but using this method, this tool, enabled us to exclude one potential explanation for our findings, that it was attentional. It doesn't seem to happen at the point of encoding, which leads us to look perhaps more to retrieval processes for the explanation. My second example is very, very different and is a beautiful example of cross-pollination, I think. So I mentioned I'm interested in higher education policy as well, and how that drives practice. And I had a project a few years ago where one of the tasks that I was doing was an analysis of strategy documents from UK universities. Two types of documents: university submissions to the Teaching Excellence Framework in the UK, and their education or learning and teaching strategy. And I had begun a thematic coding process, both inductive and deductive, of these documents, looking for how they position students within feedback processes. But then I attended a talk by a colleague in my team who was talking about a new corpus linguistics tool that she had been using in her research. She is a linguist. And I suddenly saw this spark of an idea where I could use this tool to assess this very large data corpus that I had. So I did, I used it, and one of the things that I looked at were the verbs with feedback as the object and what that told us about the positioning of students. 3 categories of verbs I looked at. The teacher-driven verbs, so these are things like give feedback, provide feedback, deliver feedback. Student passive verbs, things that imply students have a role in feedback processes, but it's rather passive, such as get feedback, receive feedback. And then student active verbs, those that imply, actually, they are agents in this process. So these are verbs like apply, use, analyze feedback. As you can see, this linguistic analysis demonstrated a very strong teacher-driven representation of feedback within these strategic documents, where the agentic active role of the student really wasn't recognized or represented.
Thank you. I will show some illustrations as fast as I can of analysis of interaction which involves, as you can understand, analysis of dialogue. So I applied this type of analysis together with many colleagues. Rochelle, Thomas is sitting in the back, and many of the colleagues from the Norwegian context or Norwegian universities work with this approach. But I also learned on the way how this method of analyzing dialogue can be limiting. It can be very generative, but also limiting. One very important notion especially when analyzing interaction, is the unit of analysis, which is the unit of meaning. So how do we segment dialogue? This is an eternal discussion in the social cultural field. What gives meaning? When does a unit of meaning start, and when does it stop? Is it just a utterance, or is it 2 utterances, or is it a sequence of utterances? So we've been working with this back and forth, and if you're interested in that, I can tell you that that's an interesting challenge, which I can assist with. But Roger Salio, quite a prominent researcher in the field, helped me and Alfredo Jornet, my colleague, to try to understand how to conceptualize this. So he's referring to what I was referring when describing the ecological perspective at the what, the where, the who, and the when of learning. So basically, he's not saying just dialogue is important. I apologize. It's about content, it's about context, it's about who's participating and engaging, and when it happens. So, we basically continued this argument, and we decided that we have to take into account the context when we also analyze dialogues. But just to give you an example of how analysis of interaction can be interesting just at discursive level, but also limiting in some ways, and so requiring cross-pollination with other approaches. You see here one of the groups that I showed before. The students are programming. They use online a screen where they project their code. So they're working. They've been working for half a day, and they've been getting stuck about using Java. I'm not a programmer, so apologize. Andres can explain more about programming notions. But it's about trying to get a solution to a problem, which language to use and how. And at some point, they keep talking. This is a long discussion. I sliced it. You see here that one starts browsing through his lecture files because they can't find the information. But not only lecture files, they're going on Stack Overflow, which is an online platform for programmers. So they are reaching out their context. They're going into another context. The discussion continues. He's doing his own thing, and at some point he found a solution and talks to the others. And besides explaining what they're doing, right, so talking knowledge, he's walking to the screen and talks and indicates on the screen specific parts of the code. So it's an embodiment. It's both knowledge, it's both dialogue, and it's embodiment. It's actually, and some form of connection with a digital context, right? So it's very complex. And this is an illustration somehow of how analysis of interaction is generative when it comes to discourse and learning through dialogue, but it requires adding the materiality, the context, the tools, and even the body, the embodiment part. And then here, I'm adding the temporality. And you don't have to understand this figure, but this is an extract of what a group of students in teacher education have done over a period of 4 months. And on the middle line, you see meetings. They've been having group meetings and discussing how to develop an assessment instrument. Here, there are ideas on the upper line. This is the qualitative researcher struggle. This is a lot of work, and it still looks unfinished. Here you see ideas feeding into artifacts. So the middle line here is artifacts. And here you see the artifacts feeding into the shared artifact, which is the report, right? And I think these are the meetings, actually. And here you see feedback, points of feedback, and those that are checked means that the feedback was followed up upon, were taken up and continued in the report. So there is also the element of temporality. And here the ecological perspective and so let's say post-humanists engage a lot in following learners over time, trying to capture their trajectories in terms of actions, talk, experiences, lived experiences over time as well. And also trying to describe relationships. Sometimes in an ethnography, which is a very prominent method of anthropology, as we all know, but we borrow it more and more. We zoom in on moments that capture the essence of a particular learning experience, right, or a learning activity. But it's still placed on a trajectory. It wouldn't make meaning without placing it in a trajectory and understanding what happens along the way. So I'll show an example, but before going there, I am pulling out an example of cross-pollination when it comes to analysis of dialogue. It's a naive one, I know, and I've done different attempts of this kind. It's basically counting dialogue. So I try to understand how it makes sense in isolated sequences of meaning making, like how students talk. But also I try to see the whole. And this is obviously a method that I've learned from researchers working in more social constructivist perspectives. So I am moving on to another area that we indicated as being topical, but I'm going to illustrate actually a method applied, which is, I would consider it virtual ethnography. But it is in the context of studying digital tools. And Naomi will continue with a more substantive argument about digital tools. I'm showing a study that's not yet published, and this is work done by Andres on learning with online platform-based resources. So basically, Andres in his PhD project is looking at how students in software engineering are learning with resources that are only online. Not necessarily of course, they have course tasks, and they have to work on those course tasks. It's usually programming in groups, but they work a lot with online resources. So he's interested in how students' what are students' actions, what students do when they go browse on Google or go on and check for resources on programmers' platforms, how they configure all these resources, which resources and how they are put together, and what affordances they create for learning. So how they help learning, actually. And we are interested in what's the potential for actually designing curriculum when students learn so much outside the formal context. Can we bring that into the formal curriculum? That's not part of his study, but we will be following up on that. And in the figure, you see basically what I just explained, but you also see the context the students are in, right? They are actually in the higher education context, in the discipline. There's a lot of disciplinary knowledge they have to engage it, also provided through the curriculum, but they're also relating to the computer science and computer engineering field, because they take a lot of notions and input from, as I already showed, from these fields. And then here you see, obviously, if you remember, the modes, the digital and the physical. The students work a lot online, but they also meet sometimes, so that offer possibilities for collaboration. Very quickly on the analysis, as I will not, we don't have that much time left. So data collected was, and here it comes the virtual ethnography bit, is web browsing history over 3 months. So Andres developed a web extension that collected students' activity online back 3 months. He also sent them a survey and asked them what they did during those 3 months with these resources, or provided an example or illustration of the platforms used, and asked what they did with those resources, what type of learning activities. And this was not directive. It was a long list of activities that the students could choose from. And then finally, he also conducted stimulated recall interviews on why they use those resources and how for learning. And then the analysis is complicated. It's several analyses he conducted. He identified through latent class analysis a number of learning practices that showed, and I'll move on, and please contact Andres for further explanations on the analysis. Basically, he identified configurations of use, as I said. So configurations of platforms that lead to a particular purpose, particular output that the students needed in order to continue their programming task. So you see here 2 examples, which I won't continue on. And then by combining both configurations of purposes and the latent class analysis he basically identified 5 learning practices, which are the latent classes, that kind of cluster the use of resources, the task that the students had, and what they actually did in the end with that task and with those resources. And this is fairly technical results. It's from the programming field, but I am assuming you understand. And Naomi will continue in the same area.
Thank you. So moving to how we study the use of digital tools in feedback processes. Huge literature here. I shan't talk about it in depth, but a real range of methods that are used. And here's a few illustrations. The big data, the learning analytics that tell us how students are interacting with a particular tool and what the impact might be. We can look at attainment. How are these tools having an impact on student performance? And then we can look at how students actually interact with digital tools through methods like eye tracking, ThinkAllowed protocols, getting that online information. But there's still a place for surveys, for interviews, for focus groups, for understanding student perceptions of these tools. And I think in understanding how digital tools can inform processes and the impact that they have, there's real benefit to using multiple methods as part of the same project. And this is something that we did in a project we completed a few years ago to design a feedback e-portfolio, with the aim of enabling students to collate all feedback information across the course of their program, formal, informal, in one place, to be able to synthesize and get information about what common things were coming up in terms of strengths and areas for improvement, and then give them the tools to go and implement that information. So resources, action plans to be able to implement their feedback. And this project we did fully in partnership with students. So students were not only research participants, they were part of the design team. And we used a wide range of methods during this project. We used eye tracking, we used learning analytics, we looked at attainment, performance data. But we started very simply by trying to understand how students currently engaged with feedback. When they went into the virtual learning environment, the learning management system, what were the challenges they found when trying to locate and work with feedback? And importantly, what perceptions did they have about how technology could inform a better way of creating this feedback environment ecosystem for them? So in these focus groups, I'm not going to talk through all the details of our findings, but in these focus groups with students, one of the things we asked them about was, how do you see a role for technology in supporting your implementation of feedback? And they talked about the value of technology being able to collate feedback. Currently in the LMS, they said the feedback was in one area for one module. They had to come out of that area and go into another area to find feedback for another task, which limited their opportunity to be able to synthesize and work with the feedback in tandem. They also saw value for technology that enabled them to synthesize comments. They say we get so much information from so many different people, and we want to be able to pull that together and get some common messages that drive us towards what we can do differently. And they also felt that technology could support their action upon feedback, to point them towards things that help them to take that next step. So you see how their perceptions here of what technology could do fed directly into the design of our ePortfolio tool. It reflects the affordances that they themselves perceived within the feedback process. Yeah? Okay, so we're going to invite you to do something else now, to return to your discussion, to return to the Padlet, to think about the signature research methods in your area, if there are signature research methods in your area. Are there common approaches that people use? And how, again, is there opportunity for cross-pollination? What methods can we borrow from other areas, or how can methods in our own area perhaps inform problems being addressed in another? So, again, we'll give you a few minutes to have a discussion about this, and please post your ideas in Padlet. Say we'll just leave this one with you to think about, rather than actually doing it as a discussion. So we just leave this with you to reflect upon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it would be I think we can go quickly through.
Yeah, I'll be super quick.
Skip the question. I can take it out.
What, now? Or?
So we're going to
I'll leave this up as well. I'll say, this is, we've worked together. These are some of our thoughts. Okay. I mean, if there's only 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, you'll be okay? You'll be okay.
Yeah, I would do it.
Okay. But we won't do this.
No, I
No.
will blind it just so we don't get...
Okay. Have you got the Padlet open? Have you got the Padlet open?
Yes,
Oh, but it's not on here. No, okay. I just wondered if people, just checking people are posted. Oh, okay.
not that much, but I like they have different colors than we have. So we can invite to continue this discussion about this one. Interesting stuff. I think you should discuss this one. Do you think it's important to know?
Yeah, I don't know how to address it, but
No, if you don't feel... This is an interesting one, but it might be a long discussion.
shall I get going? Okay, we will interrupt you again. And once again, we will return to these issues and hope that the conversation will continue. We have one more question we want to talk about before we have a broader discussion as a group. So the other thing that we talked about is how we can use different approaches to research to actually inform practice and education, and some of the challenges and tensions that exist when we try and translate research into classroom practice. So again, we have some examples to draw upon. My systematic review that I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the things we did with that was to use our understanding to inform a tool, a resource that could be used by educators to help students develop recipient skills that support the use of feedback. And again, we designed this in partnership with students. And within this toolkit, there are three components. There's a feedback guide. The students wrote this for other students, giving them advice on how to deal with the negative emotion they might experience. Things that they tried that had been effective in implementing and synthesizing feedback. Resources and activities to support feedback workshop for educators to work with their students to help them practice and develop the skills underpinning use of feedback, and the building blocks for a feedback portfolio. So this toolkit was fully based on the research that we'd done around recipients' processes and the barriers to using feedback effectively. But this is very much what we might describe as a bolt-on intervention. It's an additional thing that we can put on for students. We might do it within class time, but it's not fully embedded within the curriculum. And often when we have optional sessions, we know that not all students are likely to attend. This was also a domain general resource. We didn't make any attempt to tailor it to specific disciplines other than to invite people to download the resources and adjust them to their own context. And this troubled me slightly in terms of what we were doing as a bolt-on intervention, where I wanted to develop something that was much more curriculum embedded. And recognizing that feedback itself has its own life within a discipline. It takes on meaning. There are certain practices within a discipline where feedback is essential, and those signature feedback practices in the disciplines, that's where we should be talking to students about their feedback literacy. So we developed a curriculum design framework using the UK Quality Assurance Agency subject benchmark statements for disciplines. It's the closest we have to a national level syllabus for a discipline in higher education in the UK. And we looked for where there were cognate concepts to feedback, where we could see evidence of feedback playing a role within what students were learning about in their course as part of their program. And I'll give you one example, behavior change. So there are many disciplines, healthcare psychology, for example, where students learn about behavior change, theories of behavior change, and how to work with clients to help them develop and change their behavior. And what we realized was that when students were learning about these theories and learning about these concepts, this is the place to introduce the importance and the parallels to feedback in education and to support the development of their feedback literacy. Because if you have a dietetic student who is learning how to work with a patient to change their eating behavior, they will be giving feedback and information to the patient. Now, if the patient ignores and does not do anything with that information, they are not going to get the goal and the outcome that they need. It's simply not going to happen. So we were looking for those synergies, and we in the paper, report a series of different disciplinary approaches and how we can embed feedback literacy within the curriculum rather than as a bolt-on intervention.
Thank you. I will move on to very quickly through a project that's not yet a research project. I guess you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Yes. So a project that's not yet a research project, it's an innovation project that's intended to become a research-based innovation project. What we did in our faculty, and some of my colleagues know, we actually did a very special project where we upgraded the digital infrastructure. I'll show you some pictures. And we redesigned the classrooms. We got a new design in all our seminar rooms. We implemented, in addition, a training, or we are implementing it, workshops for teachers and students to learn how to use the new equipment, and training and online video tutorials to develop their digital competence. And we are establishing an arena for experience sharing, where teachers can actually share the experience with the use of material of the new digital structures. And the idea is here that we bring the materiality and the digital materiality. We make it more visible, and we help teachers understand how this is important in their practices. Not that it's necessarily the primary importance, but it plays a role in how they design their activities and how these activities are enacted. And I'm thankful to Øystein, who will actually contribute in one of these experience sharing sessions in the fall. We intend to start collecting data on this, and of course it will be data on experiences for students and teachers, but also we intend to implement a design-based research approach, where we help teachers design and then we help them iterate. So this is an example. This is a seminar room, and you see all the screens and you see new equipment. Nothing special, but in the context of digitalization, both equipment and the user equipment are important. So we are basically providing maybe not the latest type of equipment technology, but technology that we saw used a lot during the pandemic, and we see that it has potential for a good use. We see here a redesign of seminar rooms where there is more flexibility. There are several screens, students can sit together, and we see here screens with whiteboard function that can be used again flexibly. And this is nothing special, but we're thinking about the practices. And if you think back about my statements on dialogical interaction where tools and digital surfaces are important, or digital environments are important, all these technologies and the structure of the rooms are trying to enable more interaction, more flexibility, more accessibility to different contexts of learning. And this is an example of a possible interactive hybrid lecture that connects both students from, as we know, students from home to students who are in the classroom. Here we see potential for group and seminar that is more interactive. Students can position themselves, choose themselves how to use technology, so be actually agents in the way activities are enacted, not leaving it to the teachers. Here I copy-pasted a Padlet board, so you see this as how it could be used in a group discussion to structure knowledge contents and support a group discussion. And here it's what we call in Norwegian a colloquium, where students can sit actually and study, but also connect to some of their peers at home, so work across contexts. So returning to the argument here, what we claim is that we need, in order to bring research to practice, we need to translate our research through design principles to be able to actually apply that implementation or make it work. And here are some examples of principles that we had in mind when we started with this project and which we hope to follow upon. For example, the digital technologies offer new opportunities for connecting contexts of learning. That was pretty obvious in different ways. Digital and physical, and also micro and meso level context. The technologies are organically integrated in the learning design. What we're trying to make is low threshold access, so at some point both teachers and students feel that this is not something they have to learn. It's part of their practice, so they can actually focus on what's important in teaching and learning activities. Flexible space and technologies for support for interaction. I referred many times to dialogue and learning being a social process where there is a need for interaction. We want to provide a comfortable arena for that, and also, again, accessibility. And also helping working with knowledge, such as expression of understanding, posting, explanations, and creating concept maps and projecting them so that become a shared object for a group in a group discussion can aid the meaning-making process. And then finally, and this is obviously a generic principle, that technology can help support inclusion of students with different types of needs who cannot be or always can be on campus or have other challenges. And Naomi will take the last point of our talk before we move to the questions and discussion.
Thank you. So I'm going to leave some thoughts, really. These are not prescriptive. We're not suggesting that this is what research has to do. This is simply the result of Karina and I working together over the past weeks and exploring these questions and thinking about what can we take, what emerges from our collaboration and our thinking about these issues. So we realized that it's really valuable to take different approaches conceptually, theoretically, and methodologically to a common issue. As long as we're able to surface our worldviews and make those transparent, we can gain new insights that we can't get through one perspective alone. Learning feedback processes are complex and take place within context, within an ecosystem, and so we have to look at the bigger picture. We can zoom in to parts of the process, but we also have to remember to zoom out and take into account the context. Particularly in a post-pandemic world, digital technologies have taken on an even more substantive role within both learning, assessment, and feedback. And so we have to understand the role of those tools. Even if they're not primary to our research focus, they do influence the way in which our students learn, the ways in which our students interact with assessment and feedback processes, and they also influence our research methods as well. Design principles are essential. Having a principled approach to how we translate research into practice helps us to cross that divide, and it helps us to defend the kinds of recommendations that we're making. And the final one, when we are doing research in this area, I think we need to reflect on the role of students. We use students as participants or as subjects in our research projects, but are we doing research on them, or should we be thinking about doing research with them? And that doesn't only mean co-design and involving them with research. It's thinking about their participation and ensuring that they have agency within the research process as well. So we will leave it there. We want to save time for discussion. You will notice there is another question in the Padlet, which we invite you to take away and think about. But now we would like to invite you to share something that you've been thinking about, talking about, pose a question, but we'd really like this to be more about discussing ideas rather than us answering questions, because we've spoken for long enough.
Thoughts. Would we like to open for the...
Shall I pull up the Padlet as well?
The Padlet up, yeah.
Yeah, both.
To see the artifact that we've all been working on together, the Padlet. There are many comments. We've been trying to kind of sum up a little bit while the keynote was going on. But since we only have 15 minutes, we are going to open up for questions from the audience. But there's one comment I wanted to pull out from the Padlet, which is also not anonymous, so it's Yusu who wrote that, and I hope that's okay. I don't know where you're sitting. Maybe you can, there you are. If you scroll down a little bit, Karina. I think Yusu has written here about the collaborative research down there.
Here?
Is that okay if I pull it up, Yusu? Yeah, I'm sorry. You apparently have an account, so it automatically shows up. Yes. But I thought it was really nice, and it kind of like summed up all the things that we've been also talking about, because you were writing that interactions and connections between the psychological, social, cultural, and political research, where we kind of acknowledge the complexity of learning as a research community. And he actually has two more comments on it, if you click on the little bubble down there. Because yes, we do have different views and starting points, but we also share many common goals. So maybe we should not think about plurality from a kind of methodological point of view, but actually think about, is it more meaningful to divide, connect the field in terms of the purposes of research? What are actually our shared goals? What are our shared purposes? I really like that way of thinking about it, so I wanted to pull it up kind of as a starting point of this little discussion at the end of the keynote. And if you want to comment on this, you're very welcome, and otherwise you may raise your hands when you want to also ask something from the audience.
Yeah, I would just like to well, thank you, Yuso, for really insightful comments. And that division between quantitative and qualitative is one of those distinctions that implies in some fields a hierarchy, that somehow some methods are less rigorous than others. And it also, I think, limits our thinking about what methods we can use and what helps us to address a particular question. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a historical divide. It's one that is outdated and unhelpful in many ways.
So are there any further questions or comments, or anyone who wants to elaborate on an anonymous comment that you have posted here?
So
yeah,
thank you for this inspiring dual lecture. It was really, great and complementary. So just one additional thought in terms of methodology. I agree with all what is on the tablet. In many disciplines of the social sciences, there has been a paradigm shift, and I think this is not only true for quantitative, but also true for qualitative research, from between-person research or between-units research, comparing students, comparing teachers, comparing experimental conditions, let's say, to which has not been the case 10 years ago. I mean, Hammaker's random intercept model, or dynamic structural equation modeling, and so on. So just an added thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for that comment. It's a very thoughtful one. I feel like we took careful, cautious steps in our reflection from where the field is, at least within our community and early, and where some other developments are happening, as you mentioned. I think the qualitative research field is undergoing a big development, a big change right now, taking in a lot of input from other disciplines, but also from areas of research in the qualitative paradigm that have not been considered before, like such as post-humanist perspectives and different ways of looking at relationships. So thank you.
Any further questions? Yeah?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Really, really interesting. And my idea, I don't think that if you have thought about to change, the topic of our research, not only on learning or individual learning or group learning, but also on the learning of our personal learning environment. In the perspective of Atkins and this distributed cognition, the idea of individual plus brought by Perkins a long time ago, thinking that it's not only us who learn, but our environment. What do you think about that?
We haven't gone into those details, but in principle, the way we think about an ecological perspective on learning kind of accounts for this. And thank you for actually complementing my points here, because it's also the environment that is expected and actually learns, while the learning is learner or learners are interacting with the environment. And that's valid for both. It can be also intelligent agents that are not persons necessarily. I think it's an interesting perspective. The example that I showed on learning with platforms comes close to that. Students are really curating resources. They're creating their personal learning environments in a sense. We didn't call them that, but I think if we look at the definitions, we come close to it. But, and Anders is very much interested in this dynamic interaction between environment and learner and where the agency lies. So his third study, which I am promoting shamelessly, is about agency and where agency lies, whether it's in, and basically his claim is that it's lying in the relationship between the environment and the learners. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you think we need new research methods, or are we not making good use of the methods that are already available to us, maybe also outside of education or even social sciences research?
I think both, in answer to your question. I think there may well be developments in methods, and if we look at developments that have taken place in methods over the past 10, 15 years, they have been in response to the need to develop a way of addressing a question that wasn't already there. So I can certainly see that happening and different methods, but certainly there is probably quite a lot available that maybe we don't know about that can help us to address questions in our own area from a different perspective. And we can sometimes, I think, be in a bit of an echo chamber with methods. We see what people in our area are doing, and we adopt similar methods. We might add a different approach maybe, but really thinking a bit more drastically about where we can go and where we can borrow approaches. When we do that, though, I think there's a really important role for working with what we might call locals within those areas. So there's a whole discussion in philosophy around epistemic trespassing, and you know, when we kind of go somewhere else, or we draw from something else when we don't necessarily have the capacity to do that. And rather than trespassing, I think it's about visiting, that we can visit other areas and we can be visitors there, but we need the locals to guide us. My linguistic analysis example, I have no background in linguistics, and it would be irresponsible to go and use a method without having any conversation with somebody who really knows what that means and how it works. So yes, borrowing, using things from other areas is really valuable, but we need to work with locals in that area.
Any further comments or questions? We still have some few minutes. Everyone is flabbergasted by all the ideas and comments here. Yeah?
I was just wondering if you'd like to share with us, you've spoken about some of the areas where you've had really productive moments. How about those forays that you made, which kind of didn't work so well? I'm wondering if you would be so kind. Thank you.
You want to start?
I have an example that I can draw on, definitely. My first foray into qualitative research was a complete disaster, and I can remember the first peer review I got of a qualitative paper that I'd written with a colleague was just, it was horrendous. And it was quite rightly horrendous because, I had gone into a different approach and had not really understood enough about the method and how we demonstrate that approach through the way we write about our studies. And there's also a danger, I suppose, I've been in arguments with colleagues about the need to demonstrate rigor in qualitative research. And I think, when you come from a quantitative experimental background, you think, oh, well, I've got to demonstrate these principles, and had some really useful conversations where they've shown me a different perspective and how importing those kinds of values from one approach to research to another can actually be quite difficult. So yes, I've certainly had the failures as well.
I have an example which we are actually experiencing. It's not. We hope it's not going to end up in productive failure. We are in this big project where we're exploring collaborative problem solving, attempting to implement both collaboration analytics and qualitative interpretations of the collaboration. And we work interdisciplinarily with both digital labs that develop the research tools and help us work with the data, with researchers, but also with disciplinary researchers and colleagues from the disciplines we are investigating. And that is challenging. So we try to understand how technology works. The technologists the developers try to understand our research language and what types of data we want to work with. And there is a translational process going on all the time. We realize that we have to be alert all the time and be explicit and clear about what we mean as researchers, and they have to be clear what they mean as developers. It's a fascinating process, but it's very challenging. And we see hurdles at every step, but we manage to overcome them. But we're not yet sure about the outcome.
What's really interesting to me is you're illustrating the investment, the cost of working collaboratively, time and effort and humility and all those sorts of things. Thank you.
But also the rewards, I would say.
I think we have time for one more question, and I had one hand up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we had time, I was going to see a brilliant comment there about who are the receivers of our research. And as well as the research that I do, I have a role supporting staff who are grappling with challenges within their own practice. And I can definitely say that the key things that occupy us in the research community are not the things that really occupy the minds of those on the ground. So that pathways word, I think, is really important, that we are doing research and we can quite clearly see the practical applications, and we may write about that in our discussion sections, but that is not necessarily being translated into practice, and that then requires, I think, a further level of consideration as to how what we're doing and the intentions and the hopes we have for what our research will do for practice can actually be realised. I totally agree with you. That's an important area of research in itself, how research is translated into educational practice.
Can I add to that answer?
Yes, please.
I propose, and in some instances we've even tried co-design, together with the teachers. And teachers understanding, teachers can be academic teachers or teachers in schools, and now even students, as Naomi illustrated. I think it's important that teachers understand the research we do and from their own perspective, because that's the best test bed for actually implementing it in practice. Instead of us going into the classroom and saying, well, I have this fantastic research study, do you want to participate together with your students and give me informed consent, and go into that process as a non-agentic participant, while we could actually try to make an effort. And I know it's an additional effort, obviously, to involve them as agentic participants.
I think those are wonderful final words. Thank you so much for your wonderful keynote.
Thank you.